frankly, she rolls all over the place. And what's more, I mean, I'm sure her team will say cut, after an hour. What are the odds that Kamala Harris will not say at least one thing during those hours, which is so off the beaten track, it's actually a massive liability for her and her campaign? I would say very high, very high. So, maybe she is toying with it, but wow, is it a bad idea?
As the 2024 election approaches its final weeks, rumors are flying about a surprising move from Kamala Harris, a potential appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast. But author Douglas Murray has a warning for her, and it's not what you might expect. Could this decision be a risky gamble or a game changer? In this video, we dive into Murray's sharp insights and what he sees as the hidden dangers behind Harris stepping into Rogan's arena. If you're ready to jump into the action and stay on top of the political game, smash that subscribe button and click the bell icon.
She has a man problem, including a black man problem, and it's got her contemplating reparations.
We all know that America became great, off the backs of free black labor.
So my agenda, well, first of all, on the point of reparations, it has to be studied. There's no question about that. And I've been very clear about that position.
Douglas, is that going to speak to black men? And more importantly, should the American president be contemplating reparations?
No, I mean, the reparations argument was brought back about 10 years ago by the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, really, who kicked the latest round of it off in a piece in the Atlantic. He recently distinguished himself with an even less impressive piece of research and writing. But the minute he started that off again, there was this wild idea went around once again in America that, and indeed around the rest of the world, that some people are owed money by dint of their racial heritage, and that somehow the country they're in should pay them cash. The interesting thing about this is, Rita, is that firstly, it's about as divisive a racial policy as anyone could come up with.
Murray delivers a sharp critique of reparations, labeling it not just divisive, but one of the most racially charged policies in recent memory. He traces the resurgence of the debate to Ta-Nehisi Coates, whose influential writing reignited discussions about financial compensation for Black Americans based on historical injustices. However, for Murray, this idea represents a dangerous attempt to correct the past that risks deepening racial tensions rather than fostering unity. He argues that reparations could create resentment among taxpayers who feel unfairly burdened and lack a clear path to reconciliation. Instead of healing societal wounds, Murray believes this approach would entrench divisions and complicate efforts to promote genuine understanding and progress.
First of all, how do people think actually that race relations in America that have been steadily improving for many decades would be improved at this stage if one section, or indeed all other sections of the taxpaying community, had to just give large amounts of cash to another section of the community, to another community? How do they think that that would go down exactly? And the second thing is, by the way, it's impossible because you have to get everyone. Don't forget, Kamala said that people can't, the black people in America can't get a Xerox machine before the last election to do a copy of their passport to prove their identity at the polls. So how exactly do they think they're going to do the genetic and DNA and family tree heritage testing to find out exactly who should be paid reparations? And then thirdly, the people who have actually looked into this, which is just such a Weasley way for Kamala to try to dodge this one. The people who have tried to look into it, like the state of California, even radical Gavin Newsom in California has not instituted the reparations that were suggested, because the suggestion that his committee came up with was that millions and millions of dollars should be given to people of African American heritage. And it wasn't going to work. I mean, it would bankrupt the state, but it also just wouldn't work.
Going offensive against the idea of reparations, Murray argues that it's a ticking time bomb for race relations in America. He views the notion of compelling one group to hand over cash to another as a surefire way to stoke resentment and division rather than promote healing. The logistical nightmare of determining who qualifies for reparations only adds to the absurdity. How can anyone reliably trace their lineage and prove their entitlement in a country as diverse as the U.S.? Even California, a state known for its progressive politics, backed away from the idea after realizing it could lead to financial ruin. For Murray, reparations are more than just impractical. They're a political mirage that threatens to deepen societal rifts instead of bridging them.
So people have looked into it, Rita. They really have. And nobody has come away thinking that this divisive policy is remotely a good idea. Kamala Harris is simply pandering at the moment to a part of the vote. I think, among other things, it's terrible because it's not just pandering, it's also putting a victim mentality into a community that does not need that. It needs to have sections of it, by no means all of it. Sections of it needs to be raised up. They do not need promise of a massive cash bonanza someday down the road if they vote Democrat.
Well, last time around 2020, we had the BLM riots raging throughout that year in the lead up to the election. Race is again an issue. Democrats are desperate for it to be an issue, and their media mouthpieces, I've got to say, particularly in the past few days, have really turned up the heat on this issue, maligning minorities who are considering voting for Trump. Here is the View's Sunny Hostin and MSNBC anchor Joy Reid.
We've got to reach those ridiculous, crazy black men that did vote for Trump. We've got to reach those people.
This race will be far too close because, unfortunately, we do have a fascist groundswell in parts of this country, mainly among white men, let's be clear, but in small pockets among black and brown men, too. This happens to be a global phenomenon.
There you go, black and brown men being fascists. Shame, though, can be an effective tactic, Douglas.
Murray aims Kamala Harris's stance on reparations, calling it little more than political pandering that fails to address the real needs of communities. He argues that this divisive policy fosters a victim mentality when these communities require empowerment, not empty promises of future cash windfalls. Murray points to the charged racial climate leading up to the 2020 election, where Democrats were eager to keep race at the forefront of political discourse. He highlights media figures like Joy Reid, who have branded black and brown men considering alternative voting choices as fascists. This framing, he argues, not only alienates potential supporters, but also reveals a desperation that could backfire spectacularly.
Will it see black and Hispanic voters switch back to the Democrats or perhaps stay home and not participate in the vote?
Well, you're right. Shame can be a useful tool, not necessarily when it's wielded by Joy Reid, for instance, you just saw there. Joy Reid has called absolutely everybody a fascist. She's now on to calling black men fascists if they disagree with her. I think a lot of people can see through this. I've always been bewildered by the way in which it's accepted in America that you can talk about racial groups and the way they should vote in this way.
Now here is a provocative question raised. Will black and Hispanic voters swing back to the Democrats, or will they choose to sit out the upcoming election? He suggests that while shame can be a powerful political tool, it's wielded poorly by figures like Joy Reid, who casually brands dissenting voices as fascists. Murray argues that this tactic is transparent and patronizing, and many voters are starting to see through it. What's even more baffling for him is the way society accepts these sweeping generalizations about racial groups and their voting patterns. By reducing complex identities to simplistic narratives, the Democrats risk alienating the very voters they desperately want to engage. Instead of fostering genuine connections, this approach could push potential supporters away, making them feel misunderstood and marginalized.
And it's something I don't think that any other really of the democracies have. And it's obviously it's partly or largely because of America's specific racial history. But it's a really remarkable thing, the way in which people are allowed to just say, Black people should vote like this, Latinos should vote like that. It's like, women should vote this way. Why? Who? For what reason? And I think what you see there is just an attempt to just sort of get everyone in place. It's a desperate thing for Hostin and Reid and others to do. But yes, they will use any term against any people, any individuals, any group, just to get their way, to make people vote the way that they think they have to vote. I think that anyone from the communities they're speaking about should feel indignant like that. If I was told, white British people of Scottish English descent have to vote a specific way, or we'll call you all fascists, I think I'd feel kind of rebellious about that, actually. And I think a lot of people in America from those communities do too.
The current political situation is literally a bizarre notion that voters should conform to racial or identity-based voting patterns. Murray argues that this expectation, rooted in the nation's complex racial history, reduces individuals to mere stereotypes, stripping away their unique voices and choices. Murray sees this as a desperate ploy by figures like Joy Reid, who employ divisive rhetoric to force voters into predictable boxes. He points out that many in marginalized communities would be justifiably indignant if they were told, for example, that people of Scottish descent must vote a certain way or risk being labeled fascists. Such patronizing rhetoric only ignites feelings of rebellion and resentment. Ultimately, he contends that this trend reflects a larger failure to recognize the individuality of voters. In a landscape where every vote counts, treating people as monolithic groups not only risks alienation, but also provokes a pushback against manipulation, demanding the respect and nuance that every voter deserves.
Well, they certainly didn't react too well to Barack Obama berating them about being sexist if they don't vote for Kamala Harris. Before we move on to other issues, it's looking increasingly likely that Kamala Harris is going to appear on Joe Rogan's program, on his podcast, whose audience is massive. If you were advising her, would you recommend that she be a guest on the Joe Rogan Experience?
No, I would not. She has ducked all of the difficult interviews that she could have done. The fact that the Democrats are currently putting her out there is actually a sign that she's not doing well, or she's not doing as well as she should be doing in the polls. The Democrat plan has been hide Kamala from the cameras to any extent that you can. And specifically don't get her onto anything where there could be details expected. You can get her on The View. You can get her on a couple of other just sort of puff pieces. You can get her on the cover of Vogue, of course. But whatever you do, don't get her anywhere tough.
Murray doesn't mince words when he addresses the political landscape surrounding Kamala Harris, especially in light of Barack Obama's recent comments about sexism in voting. As rumors swirl about her potentially stepping onto Joe Rogan's podcast, famous for its massive audience, Murray poses a provocative question. Should she dare to take that leap? His emphatic answer? Absolutely not. He argues that Harris has been carefully dodging tough interviews for a reason, revealing that the Democrats are trying to keep her out of the spotlight due to lackluster polling numbers. The current strategy seems to be a game of hide and seek, with Harris shielded from serious scrutiny.
Joe Rogan is an extraordinarily talented podcaster and interviewer, and he's interesting because, among other things, he just follows things where they lead. Now, I sometimes disagree with where he follows them, and certainly where many of his guests have followed them. But the point is it's an extraordinarily free-rolling conversation. Kamala Harris hasn't been exposed to a free-rolling conversation in her time in elected office. And that's because when she rolls, frankly, she rolls all over the place. And what's more, I'm sure her team will say cut, after an hour. But if this was going to be one of Joe Rogan's mega podcasts, where he runs to 3 hours fairly easily, what are the odds that Kamala Harris will not say at least one thing during those hours, which is so off the beaten track and makes so little sense that it's actually a massive liability for her and her campaign? I would say very high, very high. So, maybe she is toying with it, but wow, is it a bad idea? Because nobody, among other things, nobody can put up with hearing someone talking about the sort of banalities and the just completely inexact policies or claims of policies to come. Nobody could listen to that for 3 hours. I'm not sure if Kamala Harris could even do it for 3 hours. I mean, to simply just keep off saying anything important.
That would almost be impressive if she for 3 hours just trots out the talking points. They grew up in a middle-class family, her childhood, her time as a prosecutor, just keeps giving the lines. That would be unburdened by, all of that.
Joe Rogan is an extraordinarily talented podcaster, known for his ability to lead free-flowing conversations that can take unexpected turns. This makes the prospect of Kamala Harris appearing on his show particularly daunting. Murray points out that during her time in office, she has largely avoided this type of unstructured dialogue, and when she does speak freely, her thoughts can become jumbled. With Rogan's episodes often stretching to 3 hours, Murray warns that the odds of Harris saying something offbeat or damaging to her campaign are alarmingly high. Ultimately, the crossroads of political strategy and public perception make this a pivotal moment for Kamala Harris. As Douglas Murray warns, diving into the unpredictable waters of Joe Rogan's podcast could unravel her carefully crafted image and jeopardize her campaign. In this high-stakes game, the risks of taking the plunge may far outweigh the potential for gaining new supporters.